Well, speaking of ministry, I once said I wanted to write a book called Second Class Christian, My Life as a Single Mom, and you thought that was a very fitting title. So I'm going to put you a little out of your comfort zone and just ask you to share more about how the church and Christians see divorced people and how that can be harmful.
It can be harmful. The church is full of people, and people are essentially flawed, and they have all kinds of ideas, and some of them are valid, and some of them are good, and some of them are invalid. Church people and church leadership, they don't always understand everything, and after all, most people that we run across that have an opinion of us as divorced people have never experienced it themselves, be they in leadership or be they just folks in the church. We have to find a way to forgive and be kind regardless of their opinions of us, because we have to recognize that we have opinions of others ourselves that may or may not be altogether healthy. And so the church really is about acceptance and forgiveness. But that's really, really challenging when things are stabbing at the very core of our hearts. So my feeling is that all of it takes time. The experience takes time to settle out in us, and the thought processes take a certain amount of time to settle out in us as well. So it just takes time.
Yeah.
You know, God bless church folks. Yeah. And we recognize that divorce is so pandemic in the church that there are those right now that have an opinion. You know, when I was married, I thought I was never going to get a divorce. Yeah. And I believe that was you as well. You don't know what happens in these folks' homes. And so the only thing you can do is just allow your heart to be softened so that you can possibly be available, not lose too many friendships in the process, at least not purposely, so that you might be in a position to have ministry if just in case someone who's had an opinion of you ends up having that opinion changed for them.
Yeah, and I also think being so in line with what God has for you that other people's opinions,
really don't matter.
Take it personally.
Really don't matter, and that certainly is the ideal. It's easy to talk about. It's hard to do in the day-to-day battle of life.
Yeah.
But that's why it's a day-to-day battle, and that's why we just, every morning God's grace is brand new, and so we just say, God, you know what? I just need you to, to fix my dumb attitude from yesterday.
Yeah. Well, something that you really hit on in your book and in your class is purity. So I'm going to let you, explain that, because in our culture today, it's a ridiculous concept.
It really is a ridiculous concept, and you find yourself sharing it. I think that in the heart of every person is a recognition that God has expectations, but the average person, including in this culture, the average Christian really has a belief that, well, certainly God couldn't expect me to be sexually pure. And really, the understanding is that, well, yes, he does, and yes, it's doable. But it's only doable if you make a decision that that's the way you're going to do it. Obviously, sex has to happen between two different people, so our attitudes on this don't really come into play until we meet someone. But then it becomes really, really important, and so the time to establish our ideas on sexual purity and our commitments to sexual purity is while we're still single and while we don't have someone in the picture. And so we just really, really talk about it and give just dynamics and scenarios of how to make it work in relationships. But suggestion number one and tip number one is that if you are going to allow your heart to get close to someone, you need to find out right up front where they stand on the subject. Because if one of you wants to succeed in that area of your flesh and the other one is not so committed, you will not be able to resist them as your heart draws closer to them. They won't understand it the way you do, and you'll eventually fall. And when couples fall in sexual relationship, it creates a guilt, and it creates a disrespect that frankly wouldn't be there if the couple had maintained sexual purity. What sex in a courtship does is it really stops the bonding process, because bonding happens under pressure. In other words, when you have two surfaces and you are trying to glue them together, the glue bottle is going to say both surfaces must be clean and dry. If you're throwing sludge on one another for the entire time that you are dating, or even if you throw sludge on one another once or twice and then you stop throwing sludge, the sludge doesn't necessarily go away. And then you go to, you walk the satin trail and you make the vows and you glue yourselves together. You spread some glue on there and you bond yourselves together, but you find over the course of time there is no bond because of the sludge, and so you find yourself disintegrating as a couple. And I think that most of the couples that we deal with, in fact, way most of the couples that we deal with, if they would be honest with themselves, would say that if there was a courtship at all, that it was a physical courtship, and it just created something that just refused to go away.
So you suggest a courtship should be 2 years. That's your recommendation. Why is that?
Heavy on the recommendation, because you can't really tell someone that they have to wait 2 years. I've tried it, and they don't do it, and it's perfectly fine. But we have to understand that our choices have gotten us into a pickle before in most cases, and we don't have a history of choosing the most constructive people for us. And the longer we spend, up to 2 years, with someone, allowing the love goggles to slip down a little bit and allowing ourselves to become more used to one another, to where we see the real person and we're maybe not quite so gushy in love. And so we can see the real person, and we can notice things possibly that we wouldn't have seen before. And if we're remaining sexually pure, there's some bonding pressure there because we're denying our flesh, because as time goes on, we desperately want to bond with that person sexually, but we recognize that we can't. And so we're denying our flesh corporately, and we're learning a lot about each other in the process of doing that. So it's really, really valid. Our voice to our classes is that most anybody can be nice for a year, but it's really in the second year that you see the nature of the person. They see the genuine nature of you, and you bond as real people instead of mushy-gushy in love people.
Yeah.
So I think the concept is valid.
It's very practical.
I think more than a year is good. Let's call it a year and a half. But if it goes 2 years, you know what? God bless you. I'll dance at your wedding. Because I just think that courtship is important.
Mm-hmm. So I remember, because he talks about the book of Ruth a lot, this is a book destined for him about Ruth and being a single adult, which is an amazing story anyway, Boaz and Ruth. I remember raising my hand in class and saying, so did Boaz and Ruth wait 2 years?
They didn't. And, eventually we will all be in heaven, and I will possibly, take that up with Boaz then. He may or may not want to talk about it, and maybe neither will I. But that was that culture, and that's how they did it. But just because they didn't doesn't mean that the concept isn't valid.
Mm-hmm. No, that was fun asking you that, though. That was one of the rare times I saw him speechless for just a moment.
Well, you have to develop an answer for these questions because they always come.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about this book at all?
Sure. This one, we've talked about this one and how it came about. Destined for Him, I wrote it primarily because we were talking so much about it and just needed to develop the thoughts and develop a companion book to working through the crisis. And what we found was that married people and church people have a concept of Ruth that is just impenetrable. But they were missing, I felt, a lot of who Ruth really was. She was single. She was alone. She had a mother-in-law who was certainly supportive, but had her own agenda. She had a lot of things that a lot of single women have in our culture. And yet, she did what was correct. She went out to feed the two of them. She took on the responsibility of this mother-in-law who was older, certainly, and incapacitated to some degree. So she took on the responsibility. They didn't have anything. They had come out of a bad situation, and yet something needed to happen. We recognize that God led her into the field of Boaz, but Ruth was minding her own business, and Boaz noticed it. And so there are concepts here that we look at in terms of what a quality guy is looking for in a quality woman, and what a quality woman looks like. And then we look at their courtship. And we also look at the notion that, Ruth was just as pure as the driven snow, but we can't forget that she found herself in a situation with a man that she had fallen for that could have gone either way when she went down there in the middle of the night and found herself in the guy's bed. The church looks at that all kinds of different ways, but the bottom line is that that's where she was. And were it not for the quality of this guy Boaz taking responsibility for the relationship, this could have gone either way.
She must have had a lot of trust in him.
Well, certainly a lot of trust, and there's biblical symbolism in there, but there's also a very, very graphic picture. She didn't know the guy that well, but he owned the situation and he was honorable about it. He was the one who said, look at, what a gracious thing for you to come down here and give yourself to me like this. But, girlfriend, we got to get you out of here. Because these guys are going to wake up and they ain't going to understand.
Right.
And so, conscious of the look of the situation. And so there's just so much there. And so we just develop the concepts. And we are respectful to everyone in the Bible story. But we extrapolate it to say, look, in your life, here's what we need to understand about the way relationships work. And so we can get some really, really good things from this as single adults.